Welcome to The Definitive Wrap, where we report the truth about American exceptionalism. We love our flag, we love our country, and we believe in America. The Definitive Wrap, where we respect people of faith, the men and women in blue, and our support for Israel. And now, your host, Bela Seabrow, on The Definitive Wrap.
Hello, welcome to The Definitive Wrap, and my name is Bela Seabrow. We thank Vin News for hosting our show. In this day and age, being politically correct is the political thing to do. It doesn't even matter if one believes in what they are saying, as long as they're politically correct, that's all that matters. And the media is oftentimes no exception. The Definitive Wrap will unapologetically say what needs to be said, and our guests will say what needs to be said, whether it is politically correct or not. And that is one of the things that we stand for. Political correctness is a poor substitute for factual correctness. Similarly, good intentions are no guarantee of good policy. In the same way, as the old proverb goes, the road to hell is sometimes paved with good intentions. Acting in good faith is not always altruistic. With us today is Dr. Martin Sherman. He is the founder and CEO of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. Dr. Sherman holds degrees in physics and geology, business administration, and a PhD in political science. His widely read column, Into the Fray, appears in a number of well-known sites such as Newsmax, JNS, Israel National News, Jewish Press, Allgemeiner, Maida, to name a few. Dr. Sherman also has numerous publications in leading Hebrew sites in Israel, such as Israel Hayom, Maida, Ynet, and NFC. He served for 7 years in operational capacities in the Israeli intelligence community. From 1990 to 91, he held the post of ministerial advisor to the Israeli government and has testified as an expert before the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress in a hearing on economic and security trends in the Middle East. He was a research fellow at the International Policy Institute for Counterterrorism, and he acted as the academic coordinator of the internationally renowned Herzliya Conference in 2001 and 2002. He was also the academic director of the Jerusalem Summit. Dr. Sherman has 15 years' experience as a director on the boards of several Israeli commercial companies. His academic publications include 2 books, The Politics of War in the Middle East and Despots, Democrats and the Determinants of International Conflict, published by Macmillan, with a foreword by Shabtai Shavit, former director of Mossad, as well as several articles in journals such as the Middle East Quarterly, the Journal of Strategic Studies, the Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, the Journal of Theoretical Politics, Nations and Nationalism and Ethnic Politics. Dr. Sherman has also published numerous chapters and edited volumes and policy papers on a range of strategic and foreign policy issues. Likewise, he has appeared frequently on TV and radio, both on Israeli and international networks, and he writes extensively on security, political, and economic issues in the Israeli national press in English and Hebrew. Dr. Sherman, wow, what an impressive bio. You know, typically I will shorten the bio, but it would not have done you justice. Welcome to The Definitive Wrap.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
You recently wrote an article, Israeli Law Enforcement, Something to Worry About. Can you tell us about that article and what prompted you to write it?
Well, you know, over the last good few years, there have been some very disturbing phenomena in the way the Israeli law enforcement establishment operates. That includes the police, the state prosecution, and the judiciary, because you find that sometimes existing law is being ignored, sometimes law is being invented, and sometimes evidence and testimonies are being completely discarded. And in the article, I give 3 major examples. The first example is the almost inconceivable behavior of the judiciary to allow anti-Zionist, dominantly Arab parties to run in the parliamentary and the Knesset elections. Now, why I say this is so surprising is because there is a law, and not only an ordinary law, what in Israel is called a basic law, which is supposed to be, a superior type of law and which needs a majority vote in the parliament to legislate and to annul. So it's not just like an ordinary law where a sitting majority can pass it. Here you have to have a numerical example, 61 votes out of 120 seats to pass a law. And these are supposed to be the building blocks of an Israeli constitution, because Israel doesn't have a formal constitution. It has a collection of these basic laws which deal with seminal issues in the life of the country, whether it's the parliament, the government, army service, etc., etc. In the basic law dealing with the Knesset, dealing with the parliament, it says explicitly that reasons for annulling or barring a party or a candidate to run for election is either if they support an enemy country or a terrorist organization in times of war, whether they promote racism, or whether they deny the status of Israel as the nation state, as the democratic nation state of the Jewish people. And the dominant Arab parties today, the one is the Islamic Ram Party, the United Arab List, and the Joint List, which is basically an amalgam of parties from ultra-Arab nationalism to communists, explicitly deny, unabashedly, undisguisedly, the opposition to Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, which is a clear, blatant contradiction of the letter of the law. And despite this, the High Court has repeatedly annulled Knesset decisions to bar their participation and allow them to participate. Moreover, some Arab candidates have identified explicitly with Israel's enemies, whether it's Syria, whether it's some of the terrorist organizations. So this is basically the first. Not only that, one of the parties actually initiated legislation, which obviously didn't get through, but initiated legislation to define Israel as a non-Jewish state of all its citizens. So there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that these parties violate the letter of the law, and it's almost, as I said, it's the courts here are ignoring the existing law. The next example is the prosecution and the conviction of a young Israeli ultra-religious man who was convicted for the death of three members of an Arab family in the village of Douma in 2015, where the house was set on fire. And the family of four, if I remember correctly, three eventually died of their wounds, and one was a young child was severely burned. Now, you must understand that in Douma, this is a village where there's an ongoing feud between clans, and I think well over half a dozen houses have been set ablaze within the framework of this feuding. The only one that was attributed to Jews was this particular one where the family was burned to death, and the only indication there was that it was not committed by other Arabs was graffiti in Hebrew on the wall of the house. Now, it took 6 months to apprehend someone. Eventually, they apprehended this Jewish youth. He was for 20 days he denied any involvement, and then he was submitted to what's called an enhanced interrogation, which is basically physical pain, and he eventually confessed. But the strange thing here is his confession is completely at odds with eyewitness accounts on the day of the arson. Eyewitnesses said they saw at least two assailants who fled the scene in a car. In his confession, he claims that he walked for 5 kilometers, which is about 3 miles, 5 kilometers alone through hostile territory, penetrated the village, didn't burn the first house on the outskirts of the village, looked for a house in the center of the village, set one house alight, which turned out to be empty, then set another house on fire, and spray painted Hebrew graffiti, and then somehow vanished phantom-like on foot. Now, this is really an improbable account. Not only is it at odds with the eyewitness accounts that there were 2 assailants in the car when he admitted that he was alone and walked on foot, but handwriting experts say that the graffiti was written by 2 different people. It couldn't be the same person who wrote the two pieces of graffiti. So you have a very disturbing situation here where someone has been prosecuted after being submitted to very severe interrogation, basically torture. And the only instance where Israeli law allows the use of enhanced interrogation is if there's a ticking bomb, if there's tangible suspicion that this person being interrogated knows something about an imminent attack, which is clearly not the case in this instance, because he was acquitted of being a member of any organization. So if obviously he wasn't a member of an organization, he couldn't have known of any other brewing plot to attack. So here you have a very disturbing case where someone is being convicted, despite the fact that it's clearly in contradiction to the facts that are being presented. And of course, the third and probably most newsworthy case is the Netanyahu case, because not only is the doubts about Netanyahu, about the evidence and the way it was collected, but there's skepticism about the legality of opening the investigation itself. According to the basic law of government, you can only open up a criminal investigation against a sitting prime minister if you have permission from the attorney general. Now, it's true that it doesn't say that the permission has to be written, but you would expect that in a case which is so unprecedented and so high profile, and against a prime minister who was not only the longest serving prime minister in the history of the country, but also by far the most popular politician, that you would want to cross your I's and dot your T's when you start this investigation. And so there would have to be some orderly record of why the investigation was launched. And initially, when the defense team asked to see the proof that this permission was given, there was a lot of hesitation, etc., etc. And eventually, they said it was given orally, and it features in the internal office protocols, which is not entirely unreasonable, but it seems to be a bit implausible because, as I said before, in such a sensitive case, you would expect everything to have their all the I's dotted and the T's crossed. Now, but apart from that, there are disturbing cases of witnesses being subjected to very harsh interrogation measures, with being sleeping on flea-ridden mattresses and then being denied the medical attention, and the threats to upend their family life by exposing extramarital affairs, these were the tactics that brought about witnesses to become state witnesses. Now, the strange thing is that when they came to, at least some of the state witnesses up to now, when they came to the witness stand, they acted more like witnesses for the defense than witnesses for the prosecution. In fact, the star state witnesses told the judges explicitly that Netanyahu had no criminal intent in his actions. He basically didn't know what he was doing was criminal. And there's good reason for him not knowing, because because the state prosecutor admitted in a newspaper interview that, oh, excuse me, that his prosecution was a legal precedent. There's never been done, no one had ever been prosecuted on this charge before. And the charge was basically that he was given favorable coverage by a media mogul in order to get some regulatory concessions. They were very valuable for the media mogul, but without even going into the argument if there was any real favorable coverage, because Netanyahu regularly was savaged by the Israeli media for some reason. And I think there's a good case for him to try and get the media to present a more balanced coverage. But this particular charge had never been brought before. And I think it was Alan Dershowitz who said this is a very dangerous move. Basically, what you're doing is criminalizing the political process, because the essence of politics is give and take. And so if every politician who gets favorable coverage is going to be taken to the interrogation room to explain what he did and what didn't do in order to get the coverage, you're paralyzing the political process. And as I say, there's an explicit admission to the media that this is a novel and a creative and invented infraction, because if the underlying reason is that no one could basically overcome or beat Netanyahu on the polls, so they try to use or abuse the law in order to achieve what they couldn't do through the ballot box. And basically, since my article was published, there's been a new revelation that the prosecution basically concealed a letter from the deputy state attorney that who examined the process and found it to be completely in line with the legal requirements. And so, there's so many lacunae here that you would expect the judiciary to stop the trial on the basis of abuse of process. Because, if you want to prosecute a prime minister, and not just any prime minister, the most popular prime minister that's ever been in Israel, the longest serving prime minister that's been in Israel, you would expect there to be something really blatant, to remove him from power. But here, what you have to do is you have to invent infractions and put all sorts of strange interpretations on actions in order to bring a charge against it. And I think this is a very unfortunate situation. And as I write in the article, the legal system basically is the bulwark between civilized society and the jungle. And the only authority that the legal system has is the credibility it has in the eyes of the public. And if you look at ongoing polls, you'll feel that there's a very steep erosion of public trust in the legal system in general, and in the judiciary in particular, and in the High Court in particular, which is an extremely disturbing situation, because if you can't believe in your legal system, what can you do? You're going to be some sort of North Korean dictatorship, and it's extremely disturbing. And I think the public are slowly waking up to it.
Dr. Sherman, what is the public's trust in the police and justice system right now?
That's very low. Unfortunately, it's very low. And there was a book written by a Canadian professor, Ron Herschel. It was published by Harvard University Press. Must have been about 15 years ago, where he then basically identified this erosion of public trust. And he says that the courts, the Supreme Court in particular, is being viewed less and less as an impartial arbiter of disputes, and more and more as a group of people who are promoting their own political views and doctrine. So, as I say, this is a deeply disturbing development, an ongoing development for anyone who's worried about democracy in Israel.
Right. Dr. Sherman, as the academic director of Jerusalem Summit, you have been instrumental in bringing high-level dignitaries from a variety of countries to Israel. Can you share some of those names with us, and how has it benefited Israel in terms of public diplomacy and pro-Israel advocacy?
Well, I'm not sure that we brought so many people. I mean, perhaps the most important person that we brought was Baroness Caroline Cox from the House of Lords, and we brought her over twice, and to Tel Aviv University, where she gave some. She's an excellent speaker, a very fascinating person. I mean, she's over 80, but in her late 70s, she used to travel to Central Africa and cross borders illegally and liberate slaves. And she's a very, very courageous and impressive woman. So and she's also been a very strong supporter of Israel. We've brought over other organizations I've been connected with. We brought over senators. When I was working with one of the organizations that you mentioned earlier, the Jerusalem Summit, we brought over an array of very high-level people from India, from China, from across Europe, and you know, I think when people come to Israel and see it firsthand, they get a completely different impression of the country than they get from the media reports. So I think that's important.
Dr. Sherman, what do you think of President Biden's approach to the Israel-Palestinian conflict?
I've got a very poor opinion of it. I think anyone who promotes the two-state solution is completely off base. I think Trump's, I mean, you know, I had some disagreement with the Trump approach as well, but far less than with Biden. I think Biden has basically rolled back all the achievements that Trump, or nearly all the achievements, he hasn't managed yet to undo Israeli sovereignty on the Golan and move the embassy back from Jerusalem. But you know, I always find it very strange why people who profess to having a left-wing, liberal, progressive perspective on politics would ever support a Palestinian state. Because I don't think anyone, even the most fervent two-stater, believes that a Palestinian state would be anything but a homophobic, misogynistic, Muslim majority tyranny. Now, why anyone who professes to be a liberal progressive would want to promote something like that is beyond me. And if you want proof that that's what it will be, just look at Gaza. Gaza is a microcosm of what will happen if Israel pulls out of those areas and allows a self-governing Arab entity to function. Gaza, you have exactly what I said, a homophobic, misogynistic, Muslim majority tyranny. And there is absolutely no reason to think that wouldn't replicate itself if Israel were to pull out and establish the state, you know, 5 to 10 kilometers from the outskirts of Tel Aviv. I mean, you know, it's just ridiculous. And, you know, perhaps I could send you in a different frameworks, some photographs that you can see from the area designated to Palestinian state. You can see Israel's only international airport, its seaports, military bases, naval bases, major infrastructure systems and installations, whether it's power stations or whether it's water conveyance. All these will be in range of weapons being used against Israel today from territory that was abandoned by Israel and transferred to Arab administration. So this is not sort of right-wing scaremongering. This is just pointing to the empirical precedent. And so I think Biden's approach to the Palestinian problem will just bring about another bloodbath. And the same can be said to his lenient policy towards Iran. There's going to be no long-term solution to the policy to Iran in some sort of consensual agreement. There's only going to be a coercive solution to that. And the question is whether it will be kinetic or not. What I mean by that, whether you can impose sanctions that are sufficiently detrimental to Iran that will eventually bring about a regime change, or you'll have to use military might. I just don't see that the mullahs there in this tyrannical theocracy are one day going to slap their foreheads and say, "Gee, why didn't we realize we were on track and we're going to give up our nuclear weapons?" I don't think that's going to happen. They're not going to give them up voluntarily. They're only going to give them up if they're forced to. And you can see what's happening now in Ukraine. Ukraine was the country that gave up its nuclear weapons, and so it could be invaded with relative impunity. I don't think that Putin would have dared to have done that if the Ukraine had maintained its nuclear arsenal. And
what do you think about Israel offering to serve as a go-between with Russia as U.S. and Europe reinforce Ukraine's resistance against Putin's unprecedented assault?
Well, to put it bluntly, I think it's a very smart public relations move by Bennett. Whether it will have any substantive outcome, I'm a little skeptical. But I don't think that Bennett is going to pull out any brilliant argument why Putin would stop. I think again with Putin, unless the pain is greater than the gain, he'll carry on. I mean, he proved how ruthless he could be in Syria. He proved how ruthless he could be in Chechnya. So there didn't cause this huge outcry as the Ukrainian case has, but Putin basically has adopted the scorched earth policies wherever he's been, and he hasn't had the same pressure as one in now. I think what's likely to change Putin's mind more than Bennett or Erdogan in Turkey is because he's also taken up an intermediary role. I think what would change his mind is pressure from inside Russia, either by revolt by the younger generation or some action by the oligarchs who are close to him, or by the army itself, who are realizing the futility and the cost of what he's doing. Because I don't even know what his end game is. Because let's suppose eventually he manages to subdue the initial resistance of the Ukraine. The Russians couldn't hold Afghanistan, but they're going to hold Ukraine. I mean, I don't know what he thinks he can do. So in many ways, this is a very baffling move by himself, because there was one stage even talk about Russia joining. It was just initial talks about Russia joining NATO. So I remember I used to have some very high-level contacts in Russia, and when Putin was president towards the end of his first presidency, there was a problem, what he was going to do. No one really envisioned that he would become prime minister and Medvedev would be president, and then they would swap again. But then there was talk there of trying to bring Russia into NATO. Of course, nothing ever came of it. But then Russia was in a much weakened position compared to it is now. Russia was very, very poor position back then. It's only basically begun to grow in power now because of the oil, not because of anything else, but the oil and the gas.
Yeah. Hey, thank you. We're out of time. I wish we could go longer. This was wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Sherman, for your time. This was incredibly informative, all the way from Israel. Thank you to VIN News, and as always, thank you to our audience for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to The Definitive Wrap with your host, Bela Seabrow. Be sure to tell your family and friends they also can catch The Definitive Wrap on Apple Music, Spotify, Google Play, and your favorite streaming service. See you next time on The Definitive Wrap.